I will address the relationship between culture and dialogue. We often talk about culture being a key element of the culture-centered approach. We also recognize that dialogue is an important methodological tool when we think about ways in which culture can be foregrounded. So what I'm going to do in this particular talk is to delineate how exactly is dialogue meant to work within the context of culture. In the culture-centered approach, we define culture as a dynamic site of meaning-making, where meanings are continuously being negotiated, they are being challenged, they are being reinterpreted. Particularly within the context of marginalized communities that the CCA typically works with, to create entry points for meaning also means that we need to think about ways in which the dominant spheres of conversation can open up dialogically to other voices. Now, of course, this is a methodological challenge in terms of thinking about or thinking through the question of dialogue, because the very tools that we design for conversation, the tools we design for listening to marginalized communities, they are often configured within the mainstream. In other words, say, for instance, we as researchers figure out how best to talk to a marginalized community. The tools then for that research design are still being designed by us as researchers. So when we take photo voice as an example and we go to communities and train them in image making to capture their narratives, we still are doing the training in terms of having power and control over the tools through which communities are going to share their stories. The principle of dialogue in this sense, therefore, has to be meta-theoretical, meaning that it has to continually come back to revisiting and questioning the methods that we engage with, in some ways, therefore, unseating the very grounds that we stand on, continuously questioning the essences that we come up with, at the same time recognizing, of course, that we collaborate with these essences or some idea of an essence in order to create an entry point for action. When, for instance, CARE works with foreign domestic workers on a campaign, say the Respect Our Rights campaign, we use tools of documentary filmmaking, tools of participatory data gathering in order to collaborate with foreign domestic workers. The tools, nevertheless, are tools that are designed and dictated by us, often as research team members. So the principle of dialogue makes us aware of this cyclical relationship, which is that the very acts of dialogue that we seek to bring about are brought about through tools that are not very dialogical, tools that are quite one-way, top-down in that sense. So when you link dialogue with the question of culture, it means that understanding and respecting different ways of doing things, different ways of knowing, also means that our understanding of what dialogue is or how we come to the space to engage in a dialogue has to be revisited. Take, for instance, again, African American communities with which culture-centered researchers have done quite a bit of research in recent years. Engaging in conversations with African American communities also means that we have to rethink about the tools of conversation, or the particular codes, rules, norms about what does it mean to converse, or what is the appropriate language to converse, or what are the proper sites of conversation. So culture allows us in this sense then to also invert the idea of dialogue, to continually question what dialogue really is, and to create opportunities for us to theoretically think through the very principles of dialogue, so that ultimately ideas of dialogue are themselves rooted in cultural notions, cultural contexts, cultural imaginations of people. Dialogue thus has to begin in some ways by acknowledging that different communities and different cultural contexts within different settings have different imaginations and understandings of dialogue and what it means to come to a space of dialogue. We cannot simply dictate on the basis of a dominant set of criteria what that dialogue is going to be. To the extent that we keep doing that, we continue to silence marginalized voices. We continue to silence subaltern communities and simply reproduce dominant, liberal, often white, often mainstream ideas of what culture is going to be, which is often always going to be the versions of culture that are palatable to us, to our multicultural sensibilities.